The air inside the music room of the Biltmore Hotel on March 7, 1952, was charged with a palpable, almost heavy intensity. Imagine the scene. The Los Angeles elite, draped in mid-century finery, gathered alongside high-ranking diplomats to honor the new Indian ambassador to the United States, Banquet. It was a night of high-stakes cultural diplomacy, a moment meant to solidify the bond between a young American superpower and a newly independent India. But seated at the head table was a figure who transcended politics, Paramahansa Yogananda. For 30 years, Yogananda had been the face of Eastern spirituality in the West, the man who brought the complex, scientific techniques of Kriya Yoga to the American public. By 1952, his influence was undeniable. Yet on this evening, his disciples sensed something different. There was a luminous quality to his expression, a quiet gravity that suggested he was looking far beyond the gilded walls of the hotel. To the historians, this event was a footnote in diplomatic relations. To spiritual seekers, it was the start of a profound mystery. As he stood to deliver his final words, Yogananda spoke of a united world, blending the practical energy of the West with the spiritual depth of the East. Then, the unthinkable happened. Seconds after concluding a poem, he exited the physical world. This wasn't just a sudden death. It was the beginning of a phenomenon that science still struggles to categorize. Over the next few weeks, the staff at the Forest Lawn Mortuary would witness something that defied every law of biological decay. Today, we step into that room at the Biltmore to deconstruct those final hours and the extraordinary evidence of a life lived beyond the ordinary. To truly understand the gravity of that night at the Biltmore, we must look at Yogananda's state of mind during the months leading up to the event. By early 1952, he wasn't acting like a man with decades left to live. He had spent over 30 years building the Self-Realization Fellowship, successfully transplanting the ancient Kriya Yoga tradition into Western soil. But there was a palpable shift, a quiet, deliberate closing of doors. He began dropping unmistakable hints to his inner circle that his earthly mission was nearing its conclusion. One of the most poignant accounts comes from Faye Wright, known spiritually as Dayamata. In the weeks leading up to March, Yogananda repeatedly told her, "My work is finished." He spoke about his life in the past tense, almost as if he were reviewing a completed manuscript. He wasn't suffering from a lingering illness or sudden frailty. He was simply ready. He frequently told her, "I have one foot out of this world," and cautioned her that soon she would have to stand on her own feet to lead the organization. Then there was his relationship with James Lynn, the man he called Rajarsi Janakananda. Yogananda had already begun the process of transferring the spiritual and administrative weight of his organization to Lynn. In their final private conversations, Yogananda was remarkably specific. He framed his death not as a tragedy, but as a mahasamadhi, the Sanskrit term for a master's conscious exit from the physical vessel at the time of their choosing. He even remarked that his departure would coincide with the visit of the Indian ambassador, Banquet. This wasn't the rambling of an aging man, it was a meticulously planned exit. To Yogananda, the body was merely a garment, and he was signaling that he was finally ready to step out of it forever. To understand the weight of that evening at the Biltmore, we have to look at the weeks leading up to it. By early 1952, Yogananda's physical frame was failing. Decades of tireless service, global travel, and the immense pressure of building an international organization had exacerbated a long-standing heart condition. His body was weary, yet his spirits seemed to be intensifying. Disciples who were with him at Mount Washington during these final days described a transformation that defies standard medical observation. They didn't see a sick man. They saw someone becoming almost translucent. It was as if the physical shell was thinning, revealing a blinding light beneath. Witnesses described his skin as having an incandescent, almost diaphanous quality, as if he were literally radiating the peace he had spent his life preaching. Behind the scenes, the master was meticulously setting his house in order. He spent his final weeks providing precise, detailed instructions for the future of the Self-Realization Fellowship. He was shifting the weight of leadership to his close disciples, ensuring the spiritual lineage remained intact. It wasn't just administrative work, It was a conscious, systematic decoupling from the earthly machine he'd built. Then came the peculiar insistence on the banquet. On March 7th, 1952, a dinner was held at the Los Angeles Biltmore Hotel in honor of the Indian ambassador, Banai Ranjan Sen. Despite his extreme physical weakness and the clear warnings of his own body, Yogananda was adamant. He treated this specific event not as a social invitation, but as a mandatory final appointment with destiny. He told his close followers he had to be there. There was a profound sense of finality in his movements, a man checking a list that only he could see, walking toward a conclusion he had already mapped out in the quiet of his own realization. The Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles was a picture of mid-century elegance that evening on March 7th, 1952. The air was thick with the scent of flowers and the low hum of high society conversation. This wasn't just any dinner. It was a grand banquet in honor of the Indian ambassador, Banai Ranjan Sen. For Paramahansa Yogananda, this moment was the culmination of over 30 years of work. Since arriving in Boston in 1920, he had tirelessly championed the idea that the spiritual depth of India and the practical efficiency of America were not opposing forces, but two halves of a necessary whole. As he sat directly next to Ambassador Sen, witnesses noted a fascinating duality in his presence. Early in the evening, Yogananda was lighthearted, even witty. He shared stories and maintained the polished social grace expected of such a high-profile figure. Yet, as the courses were served and the speeches began, a subtle but profound shift took place. The joviality began to recede, replaced by a deepening, almost weightless seriousness. Those closest to him remarked that he seemed to be straddling two worlds. While his physical form occupied the seat at the head table, his focus appeared to be shifting toward an internal, spiritual horizon that was invisible to everyone else in the room. He wasn't just a guest at a banquet anymore. He was a man preparing for a journey. This bridge between East and West, which he had spent decades building, was about to be crossed one last time. In these moments, Yogananda was demonstrating a concept central to his yoga philosophy, being in the world, but not of it. He remained a polite social presence, but his inner gaze was fixed on a transition that only he truly understood was imminent. The atmosphere inside the Biltmore Hotel that evening was electric, yet no one present could have predicted they were witnessing a final act. As Paramahansa Yogananda stood to address the guests, he didn't appear as a man on the brink of departure. Instead, he presented the image of a visionary at the absolute zenith of his power. This wasn't a frail whisper. It was a stirring oration that resonated with authority through the grand ballroom. His primary theme was the unite world, a concept far deeper than mere political cooperation. He argued that the future of humanity depended on a harmonious synthesis, combining the best of the West with the spiritual depth of the East. In his view, Western nations, particularly the United States, had mastered material efficiency and rigorous scientific inquiry. However, he proposed that this efficiency was ultimately hollow without the inward spiritual grounding found in the East. He spoke eloquently of India's millennia of internal exploration and the science of the soul. Yogananda's vision for a global civilization wasn't built on treaties, but on the bedrock of direct God realization. He posited that when individuals experience the divine within themselves, the external divisions of race and creed would naturally dissolve. Witnesses later remarked on the commanding strength of his voice. It was steady and resonant, projecting to every corner of the room without a hint of tremor. To any observer, there was no indication of laboring breath or failing health. He was incredibly vibrant, articulating a roadmap for a spiritually unified planet. Even as he spoke about his beloved India, he seemed to be vibrating with an energy that transcended the physical. There was a profound irony in his vitality, a man speaking so powerfully of the world's future while standing on the very threshold of the infinite. As the clock neared 9:30 p.m. in the Biltmore's music room, the atmosphere underwent a profound and perceptible transformation. Yogananda had spent the earlier part of the evening discussing the vital bridge between East and West, focusing on the shared destiny of India and America. But as he reached the conclusion of his address, the intellectual discourse dissolved into something far more intimate, a soul's final testament. He began to recite his poem, My India. For those watching closely, this wasn't merely a patriotic tribute. It was a conscious withdrawal of life force. He spoke the lines, "Where Ganges, woods, Himalayan caves, and men dream God, I am hallowed. My body touched that sod." As he spoke, his voice took on a quality that many described as celestial. Eyewitnesses, including several of his closest disciples like Dayamada, recorded a detail that continues to fascinate researchers of the esoteric. Yogananda's physical gaze seemed to detach entirely from the audience. His eyes were uplifted, fixed on a point of light that appeared to exist in a dimension beyond the physical walls of the hotel. In the deep traditions of yoga, this state is associated with the opening of the spiritual eye, a precursor to the soul's exit from the physical form. The room grew incredibly still. He reached the very final lines of the poem, expressing his undying love for the spiritual heritage of his homeland. He wasn't looking at the ambassador or the dignitaries anymore. He was looking toward the infinite. His voice, resonant and clear, uttered the final words, "My India." In that precise second, as the final breath carried those words into the room, his body began to slide toward the floor. It was a moment of absolute transition, a master consciously choosing the exact vibration upon which to depart. As Yogananda uttered the final words of his poem, My India, a heavy, sacred stillness settled over the music room of the Biltmore Hotel. He had just finished a stirring tribute to his homeland, his voice resonant and filled with passion. But as he began to sit down, his body suddenly gave way. He slumped to the floor. The immediate reaction was one of pure shock, a frantic rush of movement from the dignitaries and devotees nearby, including the Indian ambassador who had just been listening intently to the master's words. Yet, witnesses describe a strange, almost instantaneous shift in the atmosphere. The initial chaos was swallowed by a profound, heavy silence that felt intentional, as if the room itself were holding its breath. For those present, this wasn't just a medical emergency. It was the unfolding of Mahasamadhi. In the yogic tradition, this is the final, conscious exit from the physical body, a feat reserved for masters who have achieved full realization, choosing their precise moment of departure. A doctor was quickly called to his side, and the official cause of death would later be listed as a coronary occlusion. But the medical accounts tell a story that deviates from a standard cardiac event. Usually, a sudden collapse involves a struggle for breath or a face contorted by pain. Instead, those who reached Yogananda first were struck by the expression that immediately settled upon his features. There was no sign of distress. His face was described as remarkably peaceful, even radiant, carrying a blissful smile that defied the clinical reality of death. It was as if he hadn't been taken by death, but had simply stepped out of the room, leaving behind a vessel that remained perfectly composed, poised in a state of eternal meditation. On the evening of March 7, 1952, the official record states that Paramahansa Yogananda suffered a sudden coronary occlusion, a massive heart attack. To a coroner, it was a biological failure, an abrupt cessation of cardiac rhythm. But for the disciples in that Biltmore Hotel banquet hall, the narrative was entirely different. They believed they were witnessing Mahasamadhi, the final conscious exit of a realized master from their physical form. This creates a fascinating tension between clinical pathology and ancient spiritual science. In Vedic tradition, Mahasamadhi isn't just death. It is the culmination of a life's practice, where a yogi deliberately disconnects the life force, or prana, from the physical vehicle. While modern medicine views the heart stopping as the primary cause of death, the yogic perspective views the cardiac event as the secondary result of the soul's departure. Consider the implications for the mind-body connection. We know today through the study of biofeedback that individuals can influence their autonomic nervous systems. Yogananda often demonstrated the ability to control involuntary functions, even stopping his own pulse at will during medical demonstrations. If a person has achieved such neurophysiological mastery, is it possible that a heart attack is simply the biological footprint of a conscious, systematic shutdown? Science struggles here because it views the body as a machine that eventually breaks down, but the Vedic texts describe the body as a temporary vessel. The critical question is, Did Yogananda's heart fail him, or did he simply withdraw the energy that sustained it? The medical diagnosis provides the how from a materialist lens, but the spiritual claim offers a why that transcends the autopsy report. It suggests that the transition we call death might be an intentional act of will rather than a biological accident. Following the profound events at the Biltmore, the physical remains of Paramahansa Yogananda were moved to the Great Mausoleum at Forest Lawn Memorial Park. At this point, the story transitions from a spiritual departure to a concrete biological anomaly that would eventually stun the medical community. The man at the center of this observation was Harry T. Rowe, the mortuary director. Rowe was a veteran in his field, a man deeply accustomed to the predictable, often grim stages of human decomposition. In mortuary science, the post-mortem clock is relentless. Professionals look for specific markers, the onset of algor mortis as the body cools, followed by the chemical shift of rigor mortis, and eventually the breakdown of tissues through autolysis, where cellular enzymes essentially digest the body from the inside out. Under normal conditions, without heavy embalming or specialized refrigeration, a body begins to show visible signs of decay within days. Rowe was prepared for the standard protocol, expecting the typical discoloration and the inevitable structural changes that define the end of biological life. However, as the days turned into weeks, Rowe's routine inspections yielded impossible results. He began to witness a phenomenon that contradicted decades of his own practice. Usually, the skin loses its elasticity and takes on a translucent, sallow appearance as fluid shifts. But Yogananda's body remained inexplicably unchanged. Rowe noted that the skin stayed firm and maintained a natural, lifelike glow. There was no odor, no mold, and no visible dehydration. By the time 20 days had passed, the mortuary director realized he wasn't just handling a deceased religious leader. He was documenting a state of physical incorruptibility that science, even today, struggles to categorize. Perhaps the most baffling piece of evidence in this entire story isn't a religious claim or a disciple's vision, but a notarized letter from a man who dealt in the cold, hard reality of death every day. That man was Harry T. Rowe, the mortuary director of Forest Lawn Memorial Park. He was a seasoned professional who had handled thousands of bodies throughout his career, and he was certainly not prone to spiritual exaggeration. Several weeks after the passing of Paramahansa Yogananda, Rowe felt compelled to document what he had witnessed in an official, notarized statement. His language was precise and clinical, which makes its content even more startling. He wrote that the absence of any visual signs of decay in the body was, in his professional experience, without parallel. Think about the weight of that statement. In a facility that handled the elite of Los Angeles and saw thousands of cases, this one specific case stood completely alone. Normally, forensic science tells us exactly what happens when life leaves the body. Within days, cellular breakdown and bacterial activity, processes like autolysis and putrefaction, cause visible changes, such as skin slippage and distinct discoloration. But Rowe documented that even 20 days after death, there was no physical disintegration visible. He recorded no odor of decay, no mold growth, and no typical desiccation of the tissues. He specifically noted that Yogananda's skin remained normal and intact, retaining its natural color and appearance. Rowe even clarified that they used no special embalming fluids beyond the standard procedure at the time. Yet, for nearly 3 weeks, the body remained in a state of extraordinary preservation. It defied every law of forensic logic Rowe had mastered over his career. The Rowe letter remains the most grounded, objective proof that Yogananda's departure was anything but ordinary. Harry T. Rowe, the mortuary director at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, had seen thousands of bodies throughout his career. Yet he had never witnessed anything quite like the weeks following March 7, 1952. In a notarized letter that has since become a cornerstone of this mystery, Rowe detailed what he called a phenomenon of incorruptibility. 20 days after Yogananda's passing, his body remained in a state of preternatural preservation. In the world of forensic pathology, the timeline of decomposition is usually a rigid biological clock. Once the heart stops, autolysis begins, a process where enzymes start digesting cell membranes from the inside out. This is typically followed by putrefaction, where bacteria break down tissues, releasing gases and causing distinct discoloration. Yet, Rowe's report noted that Yogananda's skin remained normal and fleshy. His facial features did not sink, nor did his skin exhibit the typical leathery drying or the brownish-green hues associated with cellular breakdown. Most remarkably, there was no odor of decay and no visible mold growth. This is a staggering detail because the climate within the mortuary crypt was not refrigerated. It was kept at standard ambient temperatures. Rowe was explicit in stating that no special chemical treatments or unusual embalming techniques were used to achieve this result. Normally, the biological rules of death dictate that moisture leaves the tissues and bacteria begin their work within days. Even the tip of the nose and the ears, areas that usually show the first signs of shriveling, remained perfectly intact. Science struggles to explain how a body can remain physically normal for nearly 3 weeks without heavy artificial intervention. For the staff at Forest Lawn, it suggested the physical form was still held together by an unseen force, defying the very laws of biological expiration. How does modern science even begin to approach a case like this? Under normal circumstances, the moment the heart stops, the clock of decomposition begins. Within minutes, a process called autolysis kicks in. This is essentially cellular self-digestion, where enzymes leak out of membranes and start breaking down tissues from the inside out. This is usually followed rapidly by putrefaction, the microbial breakdown of the body that releases gases and causes visible discoloration. Yet, in the case of Paramahansa Yogananda, the director of Forest Lawn Memorial Park, Harry T. Rowe, signed a notarized letter stating that no physical disintegration was visible even 20 days after death. Science, of course, looks for variables. Could it have been the environment? While a sealed casket can slow down external aerobic bacteria, it doesn't stop the internal anaerobic processes that typically liquefy organs and cause the skin to slip. Some researchers point toward Yogananda's lifelong practice of Kriya Yoga. The theory suggests that intensive, decades-long control over the life force, what yogis call prana, might actually alter the cellular structure or the subtle biomagnetic field of the body. If we look at this through a bioenergetic lens, could a high state of physiological coherence maintained during life affect the rate of entropy after death? In the tradition of Kriya, practitioners aim to consciously direct energy to the spine and brain, essentially recharging the cells. While we can't yet measure spiritual energy with a standard medical probe, the result in 1952 was a body that refused to follow the biological script. The Forest Lawn case remains a significant, documented anomaly in the American funeral industry records. It resists easy categorization because, according to the standard laws of biology, the state of his remains nearly 3 weeks later was simply impossible. While the report from Forest Lawn Memorial Park regarding Yogananda's lack of physical decay was shocking to the public in 1952, it actually places him within a very specific global lineage of what mystics call incorruptibility. This isn't just a localized miracle, it's a phenomenon recorded across centuries and continents, bridging the gap between faith and biological anomaly. In the West, we see this frequently within the Roman Catholic tradition. The body of Saint Bernadette of Suberus, who passed in 1879, remains remarkably preserved in Nevers, France. Doctors who examined her decades after her death found her internal organs intact and her muscles still soft and pliable. In the East, we find the self-mummified Buddhist monks of Japan, known as Sokushinbutsu, and the Tibetan masters who enter a state called tukdam, where the body remains fresh and warm for weeks after clinical death has occurred. But what is the underlying mechanism? In yogic philosophy, the answer lies in prana, or the subtle life force. The theory suggests that through years of intense Kriya Yoga, a practice Yogananda championed, the practitioner learns to withdraw energy from the senses and direct it into the spine and brain. Over time, this constant infusion of high-frequency energy is said to alter the very atomic structure of the cells. Think of it like a biological battery that has been so overcharged with vitality that it resists the oxidative stress and bacterial breakdown that normally follows the cessation of the heartbeat. Yogananda often taught that matter is but condensed energy. By demonstrating control over his body's transition, he wasn't just performing a miracle, he was providing a final empirical lesson. He was showing that a consciousness fully realized in the spirit can dictate the terms of its own physical dissolution, proving that the soul's light can linger in the very clay it once inhabited. In the days following March 7, 1952, the body of Paramahansa Yogananda lay in a closed bronze casket at Forest Lawn Memorial Park. For 20 days, a steady stream of disciples, friends, and curious observers entered that room. What they encountered was not the somber, heavy atmosphere of a typical mortuary, but a place of profound, almost magnetic peace. Disciples who sat in meditation near the casket spoke of a luminous quality emanating from his features, as if the life force had simply settled into a state of perfect stillness rather than departing entirely. We have to distinguish between the subjective experiences of grieving followers and the objective reality of the situation. However, in this case, the two began to blur. The staff at the mortuary were professionals who handled thousands of bodies and were well versed in the cold biology of postmortem changes, yet they witnessed something they could not categorize. Harry T. Rowe, the mortuary director, documented these weeks with growing astonishment. Usually, by the 20th day, the physical laws of decomposition, specifically the chemical processes of autolysis and putrefaction, are undeniable and visually apparent. But here, there was no odor, no visible discoloration, and no typical dehydration of the skin tissues. It was a living paradox. To the disciples, this was the physical proof of Mahasamadhi, a master's conscious, controlled exit from the body. To the mortuary staff, it was a biological impossibility that defied their professional training. The room became a temporary pilgrimage site, where the boundary between the spiritual and the material seemed to thin. Whether one believed in the power of yoga or the rigid laws of science, no one who entered that room could deny the sense of quiet wonder hanging in the air, regardless of their personal beliefs. On March 27, 1952, 20 days had passed since Paramahansa Yogananda collapsed at the Biltmore Hotel. In the standard timeline of human biology, 3 weeks is an eternity. Without the heavy intervention of chemical preservation, the natural processes of decay should have been undeniable. Yet, as the staff at Forest Lawn Memorial Park prepared for the final interment, they were met with a sight that defied every medical precedent they had ever encountered. Harry T. Rowe, the mortuary director, recorded these events with meticulous, almost clinical disbelief. He noted that even on this final day, Yogananda's face remained as serene and vital as it had been on the night of the banquet. There was no odor of decay, no visible desiccation, and the skin retained a lifelike texture and color. For the mortuary team, who dealt with the harsh realities of death daily, this wasn't just a statistical anomaly, it was a profound confrontation with something they simply could not name. As the heavy lid of the bronze casket was finally lowered and sealed, the atmosphere in the room was thick with a specific kind of reverence. For those watching, the phenomenon served as a physical seal on the master's entire life of teachings. It suggested that his mastery of prana, or life force, wasn't just a philosophical concept, but a tangible reality that extended even beyond his final breath. The witnesses were forever changed. Many who arrived as skeptics or mere professionals left with a shifted worldview. This wasn't merely a body being buried, it was the final earthly evidence of a man who claimed to have transcended the physical laws of the universe. In the eyes of his followers, Yogananda hadn't just died, he had consciously transitioned, leaving behind a vessel that refused to obey the laws of entropy, a final, silent testament to the power of the spirit over the flesh. As we reflect on the legacy of Paramahansa Yogananda's final hours, we are forced to confront a profound question. Was what happened at the Biltmore Hotel a mere coincidence of biology, or was it a documented miracle designed to prove the soul's independence from the body? Throughout this documentary,